Those tricksters.
Artists often depict angels as human in form. Is that because in the Bible, angelic messengers seem to be depicted with human qualities? Some seem to believe angels were once humans, like Angel First Class Clarence in It's a Wonderful Life, but is that true? Is there one type of angelic being, or are there a variety? Demons are fallen angels. Perhaps the best known is Satan. There are other creatures referred to in the Bible as Nephilim. Are they giants or angels? Who was Goliath, and was he really a giant, or is that a tall tale? Ken Ammi will be the biblical tour guide, answering questions about angels, demons, Nephilim, and biblical paranormology as he joins our merry band in the Fellowship of the Book.
And welcome to the Fellowship of the Book. And Dr. Donald Williams is in the house, as well as Ken Ammi. And we're glad to have them both.
Yes.
Ken is kind of leading the way through this adventure, and Dr. Williams can keep us both on track. I certainly need it. And Ken, you might want to turn your mic on again. There you go. And we're off and running.
Here am I.
Yes.
You are.
So I thought to start by reading every single text in the Bible that refers to Nephilim. So you guys sit back for a while. Okay, I'm going to start now. This is Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were in the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And this one is Numbers 13:33. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim. And we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. And that's it. Now, however, considering there's only 2 verses, not even 2 texts, 2 sentences in the whole Bible about them, there is a lot to cover tonight, a lot. So I'm going to kind of just attempt to plow through it, so we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of this. And I'm also going to throw in a little polemics, because I do happen to deal a lot with what I call pop nephologists. And so we'll get into that. But that means that I'll be kind of throwing in objections and giving my answers as I go about various issues. Because what is interesting is that I'm going to actually reread the Genesis text. There's 4 verses essentially that are relevant. And I'm going to skip over verse 3 because that's kind of a side issue. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, daughters were born to them, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive. They took as wives any they chose. And then the verse I already read, Nephilim were in the earth, right? So what's interesting about that is it's incredibly succinct, but it raises issues such as, well, when was it that men began to multiply upon the face of the earth? Who are the sons of God? Who are the daughters of men? Who are the Nephilim? And then so there's a lot of details to get into, because as I emphasized in the first session in this series, the Bible touches upon issues such as this very, very rarely. And when it does so, it's very succinct, because that's not the Bible's premise. That's not the purpose of the Bible. Everything you've ever wanted to know about systematic biblical paranormology, but we're afraid to ask or something. I mean, it's just mentioned, and then the focus always comes back to humanity, because that is what the Bible is about. Our creation, our fall, our redemption, how it pertains to us, what it has to do with us, how it affects us. And that's why the whole rest of the Genesis chapter 6 and 7 is about the flood and humanity, right? So this is like a very succinct statement. It's a premise, and then we go on from there, right?
Okay, so I want to interrupt. I'm glad you said that, because what we have been running into, especially lately, is that although this is interesting and can be important, obviously, the answer to Genesis 6 is intriguing to kick around maybe, but it's not salvific. And yet we have many who seem to think that You have to have the answer to Genesis 6 and the answer to Psalm 82, and the answer is the same. And if you don't agree with that answer, you're not probably even a Christian. That seems to be a problem for me.
It's a problem in more than one way. So, for example, we humans, we tend to function in extremes. So that's why you end up with one extreme saying, nothing paranormal to see here. There's nothing like that here. And the other extreme is what I call the pop nephology, which is really unbiblical neo-theo sci-fi tall tales. It's really hard for me to put it any other way. It's basically where conspiracy theories of the wildest sorts that should have died rightful death long ago, they come to nephology, pop nephology, and they find new life. And the more ridiculous, the better, because it's become a very lucrative cottage industry. And of course, everyone needs to outdo everybody else. So everyone's constantly taking up a notch, and everyone's constantly adding more sci-fi tall tales. So this is why we get statements as this that become, I will say this, okay, fallacious nephology does lead to fallacious theology. It damages theology proper. And so I'm going to get into that a bit. So what we get out of this Genesis 6 affair, as I term it, the Genesis 6 affair, is one of the issues is who were the sons of God. And one of the first interpretations of that is that it referred to tyrants or rulers of some sort that just heaped harem upon themselves. They were polygamists, and that somehow was enough to serve as a premise for everything becoming corrupt and everybody becoming corrupt except for the eight that's provided in part. That's not made such a dent historically speaking, and I think that it was mostly based on just a particular interpretation or definition of the words that we're going to get into in a moment for the term that we end up as Nephilim. Then it's just a historical fact, for whatever it's worth, that the original, traditional, and majority view by the earliest Jews and Christians, beginning in BC days, was what's called the angel view, that the sons of God were angels. And I ended up writing a whole book merely chronicling who took which view, starting in BC days for almost an entire millennia. And that book is called On the Genesis 6 Affairs, Sons of God, Angels or Not. And I actually began it with a chart. So it's very simple. You could just look down the chart and see who took which view. And that the angel view was the most accepted is just a historical fact. Later on, the view that's called the Sethite view becomes very popular, and mostly due, or so it seems to me, because of Augustine of Hippo took that view, and he was vastly influential. So that started to gain ground, and has been pretty popular ever since in some circles. Now, I will say this, because I did wonder, well, why Augustine? Why did he opt for a view that was non-traditional at his time? And I put him on my psychologist chair, and I go, Augustine, well, you converted from Gnostic Manichaeanism into Christianity, so I could see how you'd want to divest yourself of all things Gnostic. And so since Mani held to the angel view, then Augustine would not. And to me, it seems that that's why he made the odd choice of popularizing a view that was really very unpopular in his day. It was virtually unknown. And then there are other views here and there that cropped up that are essentially don't even make a blip on the historical radar. They're just not really worth considering in terms of that. Yeah, if you want to just make something up, anybody can do that, and people have tried every now and then. But these are the main views that have been historically held. So I'm going to just function off of the premise that the sons of God in the Genesis 6 text were angels. I do like to point to Job 38:7 specifically, where it says that it's telling us that sons of God can refer to non-human beings, right? Can. And it just so happens the Septuagint has them there, and that verse says angeloi, which is plural of angelos. And then it's might be of interest too that Jude and 2 Peter combined, they do refer to a sin of angels, place that sin to pre-flood days, correlated to sexual sin, which happened after the angels, quote unquote, left their first estate, after which they were incarcerated. And there is only a one-time fall or sin of angels in the Bible. So bottom line is, if it wasn't the Genesis 6 affair, then when was it? Well, we're not told about it. And you might remember last week I happened to mention that I think this is part of why people invented this concept of a gap theory, is because they had no idea where to put it. So they claim that there's some kind of primordial, pre-Adamic fall of Satan and angels. And try to fit in between Genesis. Of course, there's literally zero indication of that, but it seems to me that's why they do it, because they don't know where to put this sin. For some reason, they don't want to put it in Genesis 6, so they have to kind of invent a gap into which force fit it. So now, the first session, I talked for an entire hour about angels, so we're not going to rehearse that, but the bottom line is I talked about how God created a physical creation, a material creation, and that angels are always described as looking just like human males, performing physical actions, and with zero indication that such is not their ontology. There's just nothing there anywhere in the Bible about that. That's not how they really are. They just appear that way. They take on bodies, whatever kind of terminology you want to invent to wedge into what the Bible says, which is just simply that's how they look, period, full stop. And so that would explain how they could mate with women physically. It was just the good old-fashioned way. This text tells us that there was attraction, there was marriage, there was copulation, and there were offspring. So it's really that simple. The good old-fashioned birds and the bees. And so the offspring were what? Well, in this verse, we don't really know much. We know they were mighty. We don't know what gave them that cachet. We know they were renowned. We don't even really know what for. And consider the context, though. They were renowned by like a completely corrupt world. So that might tell you something. But okay, we don't really know much about it.
Okay, Jeff is waving his hand. I'm thinking he has a question.
Yeah, it seems like an obvious question. You probably thought about this. So if the angels could procreate and they did so with the humans, oh, okay. Then we almost have to assume there aren't any female angels, or then the angels could procreate amongst themselves, maybe. So I don't know. Have you thought that?
Yeah. I've actually referred to that within these discussions, is that all angels are referred to as looking like human males. So if there's female angels, we're not told about them.
Yep.
So apparently they're just all male.
Right.
Okay, so that would kind of help to explain why they found female humans attractive, right? I mean, so then as we continue reading Genesis 6, of course, we're told about the flood. And so that would mean Nephilim lived pre-flood, right? Whenever it was that men began to multiply upon the face of the land, I certainly don't know when that was, but it could have been as early as when Adam and Eve's children started having children. They start multiplying. This happened, and it kept happening until the flood, right? And this is going to be very important that we pay attention to. In verse 4, it says, they were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. So that's actually pointing us backwards in time. Those days, the verse 1 days, when men begin to multiply upon the face of the earth and daughters were born to them. And after that, after those days, when men begin to multiply upon the face of the earth and daughters were born to them. That is, both of those days were pointing us backward. It started then, and it kept happening, but then that was all pre-flood. And I'm going to say, of course it was. If for no other reason than we're told 5 times in the Bible who survived the flood, and they're not on any of those lists, period. They're not there. I mean, 5 times. When God says something once, it's enough. 5 times. I think that's enough to go on. Don't you think? However, we run into this issue because I did read Numbers 13, and that is a post-flood timeline. So what's going on there? And typically, the way
so you're saying just because the Bible says that 8 were saved through the flood, we should take that as being 8 and not something more.
Yes, I think 8 is 8.
Yeah. Okay.
Good to know.
8 5 times. 8 being told 8 5 times. That's more times than murder is condemned. I mean, come on. Now, the way that pop nephologists will sell this to you is this way. You know, in Numbers 13, the spies that were sent to reconnoiter the land, they reported that they saw Nephilim. So there you go. Well, did they? Did anybody actually read more than one single verse in that chapter? The narrative? Anybody interact with it? Let's do that. And I'm really just going to start towards the end of the chapter when they reconnoiter the land. They're coming back. Okay, they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruits of the land. And they told him, Moses, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the city's fortified and very tall. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Okay. Next verse is, but Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once, for we are well able to overcome it. Okay. Then we're told, the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go against the people. Wrong brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we had gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. I kind of feel like I got to work backwards through this portion of the text, because we saw Nephilim, and then parenthetically, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. That's a bit of an odd reading of that from the ESV. Typically, the reading is that what they were claiming is that, hey, we saw Nephilim. Oh, and guess what? The Anakim are related to them. Okay, so now I guess the question is, how could it be that there's post-flood Nephilim? How could it be that Anakim are related to Nephilim? I mean, Anakim are named after Anak, who is Arbaz's son, and we have zero indication that they were anything but just good old-fashioned guys. Certainly nothing to do with Nephilim, certainly nothing to do with angels, certainly nothing to do with any of that. Well, I will note that in the Septuagint, Anakim are not mentioned in this verse, so there is some kind of textual issue there. I'll also point out that in Deuteronomy 1, where Moses is relating this event, he mentions Anakim. He completely ignores Nephilim. And to me, it's because Moses is just being way too practical. He's concerned about the real dangers on the ground, like the notorious Anakim. He's not worried about some tall tale, right? And the reason I'm calling it a tall tale is because Nephilim lived pre-flood. They didn't make it past the flood, so they weren't there to be seen. So who did claim that they saw them? Was it the spies? No, it was the 10. And I'll say the 10 because we find out that Joshua ended up siding with Caleb. The 10 who were unfaithful, disloyal, contradictory, embellishers. They're unreliable. They reported a bad report, and God rebuked them, by the way, to death. Okay, so I think that it's pretty obvious from just what I read here, because you hear this first report, the original report, it's accepted as is, but right away, but Caleb quieted the people. Well, why did he have to quiet them? Well, it seems to me that these are the historical context, the cultural context is these are itinerant tent dwellers. And now they're finding out, oh, okay, we're going to have to confront 6 people group who are strong and they live in big, well-fortified cities. That's a little concerning. So Caleb is basically like, get her done, right? I mean, the Lord told us to go do this. We're able to do it. And now notice that's when the bifurcation appears to happen. You have the 2 and the 10, and the 10 initially say, we're not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. Okay, so their concern agrees with the original report. Remember that report referred to the people of the land as strong, nothing to do with any kind of height issue whatsoever. And so they say, well, they're stronger than we are. And even then, even when they're objecting to what God commanded them, it's not enough, because then we're told they brought up a bad report of the land, and then it quotes that report, right? Now, I've discussed this with many people, including with a top nephologist named P.J. Stedman. And during our debate, he went on and on and on and on, giving examples about how the term for bad here, which KJV and others have as evil report, well, the term deba, it's not necessarily implying that it was a lie. It's just bad. It's negative. And so he gave example after example and verse after verse. And my rebuttal was, the report is not to be considered unreliable because of what it's titled. The report is to be considered unreliable due to its contents. So that was the end of that. So let's look at those contents in detail. You remember the first report said that the land flowed with milk and honey, and they showed abundant fruit to the point that a single cluster of grapes had to be carried on a pole between 2 men. And let me throw this in there, because pop nepholologists like to talk you into believing that the individual grapes were gigantic. There's no such thing in the text. It's that the cluster was large. It was plentiful, bountiful.
Yeah.
I don't even know what giant grapes would have to do with anything anyway, but they have these sci-fi stories about how there was genetic manipulation going on and they were making really big grapes. I mean, you have no idea how, anyhow.
It's because when you have big people, you need really big food.
So, first of all, they say, well, the land devoured its inhabitants. So, well, that's a straight up contradiction of the first report, which is reliable. There it is. All the people we saw in it are of great height. We can't even verify that. So let me throw this in there. You recall that in the original report, they mentioned who they saw. They saw the Anakim, they saw the Amalekites, they saw the Hittites, they saw the Jebusites, they saw the Amorites, and they saw the Canaanites. Now, wait, you're telling me that Nephilim were there also, and they're like enormously huge, the most awe-inspiring beings on the planet. And the first thing these guys do when they get back to camp is, hey, everybody, check out this fruit. Oh, let me tell you about their cities. Oh, and by the way, I forgot. Let me eventually get around to telling you about, oh, yeah, we saw the most awe-inspiring beings in the world. I mean, just logically, it doesn't make sense. Logically, it doesn't make sense. So to say that all of them were of great height, first of all, great height is a generic term that's subjective, just like giant, just like tall, just like big, just like all of these terms that pop nephologists love to throw around. In Deuteronomy 2, we are told that the Rephaim in general and the Anakim in general were, quote unquote, tall. That's subjective, right? I mean, I'm tall compared to my wife. What does that tell you? So Anakim were tall, and in general, it's accepted that the average Israelite male of those days was like 5 feet, 5'3", right around there. So you want to add a foot to that, or a foot and a half, or 2 feet? Go ahead. What does it matter? I mean, so they were tall. You have to kind of invent what that would mean. But so we can say about some of them that they were of great height, but not all of them. We just don't have that information.
This is important because, and you've talked about this in the articles you've written too. Just because someone is called gigantes, giant or tall, is, as you point out, a relative term. Now I am like 5'8"-ish. My wife's family, they're largely Danish, and they are large Danish, by the way. They're tall.
How large are they?
Well, how large are they? That's
the question, right? How
when
big
I would
are
go
they?
to family gatherings, I would have to look up to every single person I was talking to
Oh, no.
because they were like 6'3" to 6'5" in general.
Right.
Now, that doesn't rise to the occasion of being 8 or 9 feet tall. They're just taller than 6 feet, which is taller than me. My granddaughter is about 5'2". You were talking about the Israelites. She's dating a giant. He's 6'4".
There you go.
But he's not like, as tall as a building or something. He's just taller than her.
And you have to remember that the cubit is based on the distance from the elbow
to
the fingertips, right?
Right.
So that is not a fixed measurement.
Exactly.
The cubit, if you got 5 foot tall people, the cubit is shorter, so you've got to factor that in when you figure out, for example, Goliath's height. You put Shaquille O'Neal with a bunch of 5 foot people, and you pretty much have David and Goliath. I mean, it's genetically within the potentiality of the human genome to produce that.
Right.
You don't need Nephilim in order to have even giants, even a few giants, even several giants.
Good point.
Yeah, you put Shaquille O'Neal next to a 5 foot David, and it's Goliath.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, my comment is that I can see you're a true free thinker, right? I like how you correlated how if somebody's actually reporting this, they either heard it firsthand or second, and the fact that they left this astonishing fact out to the end that these men were giants, they were talking about all the other trivial things first, doesn't make sense to me. That's
it's a big tell.
Pretty good free thought. I like that one.
And what if the guys were using a metaphor? What if they were using hyperbole?
Right.
Yeah, there were these big guys there. My goodness, they were Nephilim.
The fish was this big.
They might have never even meant it to be literal.
Okay. Possible.
The fish above Bodcog was this big.
Yes.
That's what it said there.
Yeah. But the one
Well,
I
now,
caught was this big.
Let's notice something, though. Let's notice something, because those points about the cubit are very important when we get into. I hope we do get to Goliath.
Okay.
But for now, notice that we don't get any cubits about Nephilim ever. In Genesis 6, there's zero physical description of them. And in Numbers 13, It's the only physical description we have of them in the Bible, and it's unreliable because bottom line is, it's obvious from the narrative, these guys just made up a don't go in the woods type of fear-mongering, scare tactic, tall tale. They were not there. So they just made this up because you notice that they tried to dissuade the people from going into the land. And when that was failing, they took it up a notch. And then they make up these 5 assertions that are not backed by even one single other verse in the whole entire Bible. And I could go on and on about this. For example, the patriarchs and others, many people before getting to the land were told who lives in the land and who lives around the land. Not a single word about Nephilim, ever. Okay, we get descriptions of battles and even hand-to-hand combat. No mention of Nephilim, ever. We get a lot of places where it would figure that Nephilim would be mentioned because they're there on the ground doing stuff. Nope, never, ever. So these guys end up contradicting Moses, Caleb, Joshua, God, and the whole rest of the entire Bible, because all of them affirm sure Anakim were around and others, but none of them ever say a single word about Nephilim, ever. It does not exist. They didn't make it past the flood in any way, shape, or form, nor by any other name, incidentally. So that's an important issue to get into, because when you get pop post-flood nephologists up against the wall, they'll play the name game. They'll say, well, because post-flood Nephilim, they were called Rephaim. Those are Nephilim 2.0, you know. No, there's zero indication of that. Nothing ever. In fact, in Deuteronomy 2, we're told that Rephaim were also AKA Zamzumim or Zuzim, and that Amim and Anakim were part of the Rephaim. I kind of think of them as clans of the tribe, right? But there's no reference to any correlation to Nephilim, period, full stop. It's not there. So the way that you manipulate things to claim that Rephaim were Nephilim is in a few ways. One of them, you look at Numbers 13:33. Hopefully you don't interact with the narrative. You just look at the one single verse and you pick it up and you run with it and you apply it, which is hermeneutically disastrous, right? Then you only look at non-Septuagint things of it, so you can have the Anakim stuck in there. Then you extrapolate and you say, well, because Anakim were Rephaim, now we can claim that Anakim were related to Nephilim, therefore all Rephaim were related to Nephilim. You see, it's assumption and assertion and assumption and assertion, like a bottomless pit of assertions and assumptions, and then you come to your conclusion. It's completely invalid. But there's another aspect to this, which it seems to me, okay, so when we're doing Old Testament studies, obviously, in order to get some of the historical context and cultural context, you want to look at ancient Near East literature and pagan mythology, just to kind of get a taste of what is it that the Israelites were dealing with, and some of the kind of more obscure statements. To kind of give an example we touched upon last week from the New Testament in a different time, Peter's reference to Tartarus. You're not going to look into the Bible to figure out what that's about. You have to look at Greek thought and mythology. So likewise, in the Old Testament with ancient Near East, but I think the problem is, it's one thing to inform ourselves as to what they believe. It's another thing altogether to take that pagan mythology and then insert it into our biblical theology. And this is the way it works. Well, you know, in ancient Near East literature, such as Ugaritic texts, when a king and a hero died, they were called a king or a hero. But after they've been dead for a while, they're referred to as Rephaim or Repum, you know, however they managed to pronounce that back then. And you could, during rituals, you could summon up these spirits of the dead kings and heroes, and they would attend the rituals and ceremonies and all this stuff. Therefore, Rephaim were some sort of non-human living dead.
Mhm.
And then you could go even further and say that they're actually the spirits of dead Nephilim. I mean, you can make up this whole entire mythological scenario, but biblically, there's nothing to do with that. Nothing. The problem is that the root word Rapha, it has a wide range. It can refer to healing. It can refer to death.
Mhm.
And so there are texts in the Bible where the dead are referred to as Rapha, and so or Rephaim. And then you say, well, I'm going to take a reference, and that's a jump. That's a jump right there.
Mhm.
And even God is referred to as a Rapha, right? Yahweh Rapha, the God
healer.
who heals.
Right.
So you even have usages of that root in the Bible that is about
Mhm.
healing and not about death. So this is just like kind of a linguistics and mythical and logical mess, just kind of all watered down and mashed together to result in post-flood Nephilim. Why do we need post-flood Nephilim? I have no idea, but there's people who are literally obsessed to have them. So what ends up happening is once you go to Numbers 1333 and you actually believe it and you apply it, now let me just ask you this. So for anything else in your whole entire life, much less these theological issues, do you really rely on unfaithful, disloyal, contradictory, embellishing, unreliable guys whom God rebuked? Do you go, yeah, what they said, that's absolutely true. It's infallible. I'm going to go and go with that. Yeah, I'm going to go with their advice. Nobody does that for anything else in their whole entire life. But what happens is then that verse becomes it becomes a worldview philosophy, and that's why you end up with these pop nephologists reading that into Deuteronomy 2, which says nothing about it, into who the Rephaim are, which the Bible says nothing about, and going back to Genesis 6, because what they'll say is, well, it says that they were on the earth in those days and also afterward. So that's after the flood. Okay, for one, we already reviewed that those days and after that is pointing you backwards in time, not forwards, because it's telling you how to understand those days. It's when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. That's backwards. And also, it's cheating because that's verse 4. The flood isn't even mentioned for the very first time until verse 17. So you're reading ahead, then you find out about the flood, and then you backtrack to insert it into a text that states nothing about it whatsoever. Nothing. But see, it becomes this worldview, and it becomes this sort of, like I said, it's an all-encompassing theory that
Right.
they end up getting out of this mistaken notion here. And also, of course, some of them will point blank claim that the flood was to get rid of Nephilim. I mean, I'd be more generic, like, well, the flood was to do away with everybody who wasn't in the ark and most animals. Okay, I
Right.
mean, sea life survived, some insects survived, this and this survived, but guess what? God didn't fail. No, God didn't miss a loophole, and the flood was not much of a waste. Now, you where's our regard for God when we talk about arguments for post-flood Nephilim? Where's our regard for God and His Word?
Right.
Because in order to get them past the flood, pop nephologists, of course, they're forced to literally invent unbiblical tall tales about how they made it past the flood. Some of them will literally claim that they survived.
Wow.
That contradicts the Bible 5 times right off the bat. Some of them claim that there were more falls of angels after the flood. There's literally zero indication of that. And others just make up stuff like the Book of Jubilees, which is pseudepigraphical. So we're talking roughly Second Temple era, millennia after this event, centuries after the Torah. Well, somebody found a recipe basically for making fresh, hot out of the oven, homemade Nephilim, and that's how they came back after the flood. Well, that's not the recipe for Nephilim. It's sons of God mating with the daughters of men. So, and then we talked when I discussed demons last week about how another pseudepigraphical text, First Enoch, which is just Bible contradicting folklore, it doesn't even have post-flood Nephilim. It has them, and not physically anyway. It has them coming back in the form of evil, unclean spirits. And we went over how it's not the best option for identifying demons. Jubilees, incidentally, does have post-flood Nephilim, but only till the time of Noah's grandsons. So even in the Apocrypha and the pseudepigrapha and anything else, you don't even have this reliably in there. It's just a non-existing, non-issue. So now let's talk about the linguistics, because that is actually a gigantic issue. Is the linguistics? Don already touched upon this, right? So if I'm reading a version like it's not the ESV, let's say I'm reading the KJV, and I've literally heard this from KJV only people, where well, Nephilim were giants because Genesis 6:4 said they were giants. Do you realize that doesn't mean anything? I mean,
right.
The word giants is it's a flaccid designator, right? It's a use of lekendi. It's in linguistics. It's a term that's vague, generic. It's subjective. It really has not any or much of a meaning on its own. It's given meaning by its context. So, for example, I've said my wife calls me a giant all the time, and I'm just Steven, right? So, okay, giant could mean a couple of inches taller than the average. Yeah, but some people use it to mean a feet above the subjective average. Yeah, but some people use it to mean entire body lengths above the subjective average. And how many inches, how many feet, how many body lengths? That's completely subjective. It's just whatever you want to throw in there. Not to mention the term giant can also be completely hyperbolic or symbolic. Elon Musk is a giant of high tech. That doesn't tell you anything about its size, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So the question is, and I've asked this question to literally hundreds and hundreds of people who go on and on and on and on about giants. I'll ask them these three questions. What's the usage? Let me pause there a second. You see, a word has a meaning or a definition, and usually has more than one meaning and more than one definition, but even more usages, right? So you could do all the root word study that you want on the word bad. None of that's going to tell you anything about what it meant in Michael Jackson's song by that title, right?
Right.
So I'll ask, what is the usage of the vague, generic, subjective, multi-usage, and modern English word giants in the Bible? And then I'll ask them, what's your usage? And then do those two agree? Now, I kid you not, 99.9% of people whom I ask that do not even reply. It just shows the abject ignorance within pop nephology circles. So what's their usage? It's typically something completely useless about subjectively unusual height of some unknown sort. Okay, well, biblically, in English Bibles, let's start there, the term giant is merely rendering, it's not even translating, it's rendering either Nephilim in 2 verses or Repha or Rephaim in 98% of all others. And it never implies anything about any kind of height whatsoever. It's just rendering those 2 words for 2 people groups. That's all it is. So do the usages agree? No. Most pop nephologists do not agree with the biblical usage. So then why did this come about, the term giant? Well, it's because the Septuagint, 300 BC, roughly right around there, it rendered, again, didn't translate, it rendered, get this, the word Nephilim and Gibborim and Rephaim, all as gigantes, or sometimes gigas. Now, I'll just say that that was a terribly bad idea to render three very different words, very different morphology, and very different meanings, all with one single word. That was a terrible idea, and it led to some of the problems that still haunt us today. Giborim, that's just a generic descriptive term for might or mighty, right? Nephilim are referred to as Giborim. And so are angels. So is Gideon. So is Boaz. So is God. Isaiah 9, right? El Gibor.
Mm-hmm.
And gigantes, that literally means earth-born. And gigas is much of the same, right? Because gigantes or gigas, it's really a reference to the false Greek goddess Gaia, the earth goddess. And so gigantes, earthborn, really means born of Gaia. And I know MJ will be interested in this, that in the Greek mythology, what you have is Uranus, the sky god, mating with Gaia, the earth goddess, and producing the Titans, which to me is just like fate memories of the sky. So you have the angels coming down the earth and mating with the earth, the human women that are earthly, and producing this unusual offspring. And
not to mention the other things they created, such as the 100-handed wands and stuff. So
right, that's when you get into the different generations of Titans, some of which are, become quite outlandish. But then, so there's another thing I wanted to point out, and maybe the last thing, because I see we're running out of time. I told you there's a lot to cover in two little verses. Because some people claim that, well, the Hebrew root for the word Nephilim is not nephal, which would mean fall, fallen, feller, to cause to fall, right? It's really the Aramaic nephilah, and that means giants. And I'm saying that because Dr. Michael Heiser, who was completely qualified to speak on the linguistics, that was his take on it. It's derived from nephilah in Aramaic, and it means giants. So to me, that begs the question, okay, now you got to tell me what giant means, right? But this kind of becomes an argument between amongst the scholars, because the J. Edward Wright Endowed Professor of Judaic Studies, who is Edward Wright, PhD himself, is the director of the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Arizona, and he wrote, the term traditionally translated as giants in both the Greek Septuagint, gigantes, and now in English is Nephilim, a term based on the root nephal, meaning fall. It has nothing to do with size. And he specifies that this goes for the Hebrew and the Aramaic as, quote, the root nephal, or nephilah, in Aramaic also means fall, not giant. Okay, so one of the issues is that if you read the word giant, you merely imagine what that means, something about height that's completely generic, and then you pour that meaning into the word, and then you apply it that way. That's called the word concept fallacy. It's like a form of eisegesis. You're reading into a word, and then you're applying as if that word is implying your subjective, not. But incidentally, as far as Heiser, he did tell us what he meant by giant. He wrote, I don't think the biblical giants were taller than unusually tall people of modern times, between 7 and 9 feet. And yeah, I'd go with that. So if you want, we could talk about Goliath really quickly. And I had another one I wanted to mention, because for some reason people get obsessed about height. Subjectively unusual height in the Bible is essentially a non-issue. It's like completely irrelevant. We're told two specific heights. One of them is an Egyptian who was 7'5". And the issue with Goliath is interesting because the Masoretic text has him as, let's say, just shy of 10 feet. But the earlier Septuagint and the earlier Dead Sea Scrolls and the earlier Flavius Josephus all have them as just shy of 7 feet. And so all I'm saying is that's the preponderance of the earliest data we have. And then the issue with King Og of Bashan, pop nepholologists will tell you that he was 13 feet tall. And how do we know that? Since we are not given a physical description of him, well, it's because his bed was about 12 feet tall or long. So then they figure or the other way around, 13 feet, he was like 12, right around there, whatever. They just subtract about a cubit or a foot from his bed. Well, that's based on a tremendous series of mere assumptions. I wrote an entire book about Og, and I'll just give you the bottom line. That so-called bed wasn't a thing upon which he slept. It was a ritual object. We found one much like it in a ziggurat. So it's not like my bed. You could measure my bed. You could subtract a foot. You'd get a good idea of my height. But incidentally, you'd also think I was about 5 times wider than I actually am. So that's just one of those tall tales that comes out of pure assumptions and being obsessed. I've ended up coming up with the term gigorexia nervosa, which I define as the obsessive desire to see giants and just making them up where they're nowhere to be found. I think at this point I'll watch my breath.
Yeah, I want to go over because Walter Fulger has repeated his statement 2 times here, so it seems important to him. That does not mean fall. It is a directional word. It means downward, no fall. I'm not sure what that's talking about, but
yeah, well, it's talking about the fall, and I mean, okay, to me, downward is a fall. I mean, I don't know if it's that big a deal. I do appreciate Walter. I see he's been making some friendly and important comments. Unfortunately, I've had to talk so much. I haven't been able to pay attention too much. And yeah, he's talking about the size of the bed, but yeah, you have to assume that you, good old-fashioned modern Joe, has a bed like an ancient sovereign who lived the lifestyles of the rich and infamous, you know. And I mean, again, it's more likely it wasn't even a bed. It's a ritual object.
Right. Right, and that is always the problem, which is why we need to go back to the historical grammatical, how did they understand it? Because too often we tend to interpret the ancient text based on how we live today.
Right.
And they're not connected, really.
And in fact, somebody just recently asked me, well, why would the translators or renderers of the Septuagint, why would they have done that? Use gigantes for Nephilim, Giborim, and Rephaim. It's like, I have no idea. They didn't tell us. I mean, I have absolutely no idea. I just know it was a terrible idea. I don't know why. There's no telling why. Were they kind of appealing to their Greek audience and trying to touch upon their mythology a little bit? Maybe, but we actually don't know.
I'm glad that Ken brought up the application of ancient Near Eastern mythology. I think that's a really important point, because what people don't understand is that, yes, the Bible actually does reference that stuff, and it's almost always to create a contrast between what the biblical text is saying and what the general view of the people around Israel was. The very beginning of the creation story, you know, it sounds a little bit like the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the Apsu and Tiamat. And it's supposed to sound like it because it's refuting it. It's telling you the exact opposite from what these guys believe is what actually happened, what God actually did, because we've got an exact opposite kind of God. Instead of in the beginning was the primordial freshwater and saltwater seas, and the gods were born from their sexual union. In the beginning, God created Apsu and Tiamat. So it's taking that stuff, standing it on its head. And people are constantly trying to use that stuff to read it into Scripture.
Mhm.
But the basic pattern is, yeah, it's there, all right, but it's there for the sake of the contrast, not the similarity.
Right.
And the
Like dilemma.
example that Ken brought up fits exactly into that pattern.
Mhm.
That's a very important point to make.
Yep. Good point.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, 5 minutes. Where are we going to go?
What?
Okay,
Oh.
I got a question. So I know this is kind of off topic because we're sticking with the Bible, but you did mention a couple of the other apocryphal, So where does the Kabbalah fit in? Because I see that people are kind of going way off the rails. Once you get outside of the Bible, which I don't know, I was going to say, how long did it take you to figure all this out? Like years, but that's another question. But is the Kabbalah, I'm studying with a friend who's a Jew, and he's going off in all these directions, and I think he is grounded in that too, or he's open to it. He's getting stuff from that. Where does the Nephilim fit in the Kabbalah and all that teaching?
So let me point out, incidentally, that I did publish about a dozen books on nephology. And they're all research-based, right? So, for example, I published one that's entirely about the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, what they have to say. It's all research. Kabbalah, well, that is a huge topic. Essentially, you're dealing with rabbinic Judaism, right? Very different from the biblical faith. It's rabbinic Judaism, and then there's a mystical arm of rabbinic Judaism, which is Kabbalism. And so this would tend towards the mystical, and it would tend towards things that are extremely difficult to take literally because of the mystical aspect of it. You kind of never know if what they're saying is meant to be taken as is or meant to be some kind of parable for something else. Probably began roughly 200-300 AD and then became really, really, really big around the 1300s or so and up until this day. But I mean, so I'm just saying generically, whatever you might happen to run into in terms of nephology in there, you'll have to take it with a grain of Dead Sea salt.
Good point. Good point.
All right. Thank you.
Actually wondering, how does the angels and demons and Nephilim in Islam compare to Jewish/Christian tradition?
So I mean, Islam does touch upon this stuff a bit here and there. Of course, their concept of angels and demons would be almost more generic, like that there's what they call jinn, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. So it's not quite as bifurcated, as distinct as it is in biblical theology. And then they do have these concepts of fallen angels way back, procreating with women and creating these things. I mean, it should be understood that the Quran, particularly, is basically a mishmash of watered down Christianity and also very much so Rabbinic Judaism's Talmudic traditions or midrashic statements, which are really more like homiletical. They're more like sermonizing. So whoever mashed the Quran together literally just took a little bit from here, a little bit from there, didn't quite know how to distinguish apparently between what was supposed to be considered actual scripture versus tradition or folklore, and really, really just kind of mashed it together.
So it wasn't the angel Gabriel?
No, he's a good guy.
Probably Moroni's brother or something like that.
Yeah, like
Like,
Chuck Missler used to say that Moroni stands atop the LDS temple tooting his own horn.
that's very much true. I was just going to point something out regarding Goliath. I think what people get caught up in is again the 6 cubits and the span, and then the weight of his armor, this 5,000 shekels, and then his spear was like 600 shekels of iron. So I guess they look at those numbers and they think, wow, this guy must be really huge. You know what I'm saying? But if somebody around the size of 7 feet or so could easily pick something up heavy, I mean, look, these guys were probably, sort of like weightlifters type of people, and those guys can pick up 200 pounds easily or whatever.
It's
So
interesting to say that. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so it doesn't, the fact that they could have been, over 10 feet tall doesn't really, like you said, it doesn't flow necessarily.
I mean, first of all, you can have a 15, 20-foot Goliath. What do I care? It's a non-issue to me. I just don't know what it has to do with anything.
Right. Either way, David defeated him.
Right,
Either way,
exactly.
David
Right.
defeated him, and yes, you can look up a bodybuilding, or not bodybuilding, specifically weightlifting or strongman competitions, and you can see guys that are just right around 6 feet lifting 1,000 pounds. It's doable, and Goliath did have a guy helping him with his equipment. But again, why obsess over this height issue? It's a biblical non-issue, and it doesn't correlate to Nephilim, because again, we have no physical, no reliable physical description of them. So what does that matter? So that's why I'm saying, you want to have a taller Goliath, go ahead and have him. I hope he enjoyed himself. What do you want?
Yeah, he's not around anymore, and and it doesn't say that there were others. So he seems to.
I got no dog in this fight. I just have a God in this fight.
There you go.
You could also chalk up like Goliath's, massive height if it was like actually said in the Bible to like maybe having a genetic condition like giantism.
Yeah, people like Andre the Giant. Remember that wrestler?
Yeah, I think there was one guy. I think he lives in Turkey who broke the Guinness World Record for being the tallest human at like 10 feet or something like that. And he had
that's only one guy.
So
it's not like a whole slew of them.
Of course, the issue is a lot of those people would not function on a battlefield. They're in very bad shape. That's why you would get these arguments that it can't be a pituitary gland or a pineal gland issue. It has to be something that
supernatural
Nephilim genetics made it past the flood somehow, as if God missed the genetic loophole incidentally. But again, then we go back to, well, what makes you think that Nephilim were taller than average? You've got no reliable information. And in fact, again, taking the angel view, guess what? Angels look just like human males, and human women look just like human women. So both of their parentage were just average-looking people. Why would their offspring be something completely different, like monstrous or gigantic or whatever words we want to use to make them sound like they were more than apparently they were?
Right.
Okay. Well, then we're right at the end of the time here. A couple, 3 minutes over. We're going to, especially late at night, we're going to take care of being good stewards of the time people give to us. I appreciate that. Next week, we have Carl Tykrib joining us, and he's going to start off our session on Game of Gods, the Game of Gods. So that'll be next Tuesday at 8 Central again. So thank you all for joining us. Ken, thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
Dr. Williams, thank you for being here.
Yes, appreciate your input.
Everybody else, we're going to say adios.
Adios.